Hello, and welcome back to Let's Play The Elder Scrolls III, Morrowind, Game of the Year Edition. Once again, it is story time. Fedar found quite a bit to read in Hlaod and Ebonheart. We're actually going to start in Ebonheart because Fedar set his Mark spell in front of the Argonian mission there. Were we to start in Hlaod, Fedar would have to run there first, and that would take a while. Okay, here we are. And speaking of the Argonian mission, the first book we're going to read is in there.
What do you ask, Master?
Greetings, Mutsera.
Let's see.
This is an honor for me.
Yeah, quite a journey to reach a book. Hello again. Pardon me?
You honor me. Please speak.
Nope, I'll just be reading. Thanks. The Marksmanship Lesson by Alla Lolith. Kelmeril Bryn had very definite opinions on how things should be done. Every slave he bought on the day he bought him or her was soundly whipped in the courtyard for a period of 1 to 3 hours, depending on the individual degree of independent spirit. The whip he used, or had his castellan use, was of wet, knotted cloth, which regularly drew blood, but very seldom maimed. To his great satisfaction and personal pride, few slaves ever needed to be whipped more than once. The memory of their first day, and the sight and sound of every subsequent slave's first day, stayed with them throughout their lives. When Bryn bought his first Bosmer slave, he ordered his castellan to whip him only for an hour. The creature, which Bryn had named Dob, seemed so much more delicate than the Argonians and Khajiiti and Orcs who made up the bulk of his slaves. Dob was clearly ill-suited for work in the mines or in the fields, but he seemed presentable enough for domestic service. Dob did his work quietly and tolerably well. Bryn occasionally had to correct him by refusing him food, but the punishment never needed to go further. Whenever guests arrived at the plantation, the sight of the exotic and elegant addition to Bryn's household staff always impressed them. "Here, you," said Genetha Illic, a minor but still noble member of the House Indoril, as Dob presented her with a glass of wine. "Were you born a slave?" "No, Sidura," Dob answered with a bow. "I used to rob nice ladies like you on the road." The company all laughed with delight, but Kelmeril Bryn checked with the slave trader from whom he had bought Dob, and found that the story was true. The Bosmer had been a highwayman, though not one of any great notoriety, before he had been caught and sold into slavery as punishment. It seemed so extraordinary that a quiet fellow like Dob, who always looked respectfully downward at the sight of his superiors, could have been a criminal. Bryn made up his mind to question him about it. "You must have used some sort of weapon when you were robbing all those pilgrims and merchants," Bryn grinned as he watched Dob mop. "Yes, Sidura," Dob replied humbly. "A bow." "Of course. You Bosmeri are supposed to be very handy with those," Bryn thought a moment, and then asked, "A bit of a marksman, were you?" Dob nodded humbly. "You will tutor my son Wodalic in archery," the master said after another moment's pause. Wodalic was 12 years of age and had been rather sadly spoiled by his mother, Bryn's late wife. The boy was useless at swordplay, fearful of being cut. He embarrassed his father's pride, but the personality defect seemed ideally suited to the bow. Bryn had his castellan purchase a finely wrought bow, several quivers of arrows, and ordered targets to be set up in the wildflower field next to the plantation house. In a few days' time, the lessons began. For the first few days, the master watched Wodalic and Dob to be certain that the slave knew how to teach. He was pleased to see the boy learn the grips and the different stances. Business concerns, however, had to take precedence. Bryn only had time to see to it that the lessons were continuing, but not how well they were progressing. It was a month's time before the issue was re-examined. Bryn and his castellan were reviewing the plantation's earnings and expenses, and they had come to the area of miscellaneous household costs. "You might also check to see how many targets in the field need to be repaired." "I have already anticipated that, Sidura," said the castellan. "They are in pristine condition." "How is that possible?" Bryn shook his head. "I've seen targets fall apart after only a few good shots. There shouldn't be anything left after a month's worth of lessons." There are no holes of any kind in the targets, Sedura. See for yourself. As it happened at that hour, the marksmanship lesson was underway. Bryn walked across the field, watching Dob guide Wodalik's arm as the boy took aim at the sky. The arrow flew up into an arc, over the top of the target, burying itself in the ground. Bryn examined the target and found it to be, as his castellan said, in pristine condition. No arrow had touched it. Master Wodalik, you must pull your right arm down further, Dob was saying, and the follow-through is essential if you expect your arrow to gain any height. Height? Bryn snarled. What about accuracy? Unless he's been secretly racking up a high kill ratio on birds, you haven't taught my son a thing about marksmanship. Dob bowed humbly. Sedura, first Master Wodalik must become comfortable with the weapon before he need worry about accuracy. In Valenwood, we learn by watching the bolt arc at different levels, in different winds, before we try very hard to strike targets. Bryn's face turned purple with fury. I'm not a fool. I should have known not to trust a slave with my boy's education. The master grabbed Dob and shoved him toward the plantation house. Dob, head down, began the humble, shuffling walk he had learned in his domestic duties. Wodalik, tears streaming down his face, tried to follow. You stay and practice, roared his father. Try aiming at the target itself, not at the sky. You are not coming back into the house until there is one hole in that damned bullseye. The boy tearfully returned to practice, while Bryn brought Dob into the courtyard and called for his whip. Dob suddenly broke away and scrambled to hide between some barrels in the center of the yard. Take your punishment, slave. I should have never shown you mercy the day I bought you, Bryn bellowed, bringing the whip down on Dob's exposed back again and again. I have to toughen you up. There'll be no more soft jobs as tutor and valet in your future. Wodalik's plaintive yell drifted in from the meadow. I can't. Father, I can't hit it. Master Wodalik, Dob cried back as loud as he could, his voice shaking with pain. Keep your left arm straight and aim slightly east. The wind has changed. Stop confusing my son, Bryn screamed. You'll be in the salt rice fields if I don't beat you to death first, like you deserve. Dob, the boy wailed, far away. I still can't hit it. Master Wodalik, take 4 steps back, aim east, and don't be afraid of the height. Dob tore away from the barrels, hiding under a cart near the wall. Bryn pursued him, raining down blows. The boy's arrow sailed high over the target and kept climbing, reaching a pinnacle at the edge of the plantation house before coming down in a magnificent arc. Bryn tasted the blood before he realized he'd been hit. Gingerly, he raised his hands and felt the arrowhead protruding out of the back of his neck. He looked at Dob crouching under the wagon and thought he saw a thin smile cross the slave's lips. Just for an instant before he died, Bryn saw the face of the rogue highwayman on Dob. Bullseye, Master Wodalik, Dob crowed. Sounds like Dob was an excellent mentor after all. Okay, thanks for letting me read that. On to the next book.
This is an honor for me.
Which is in the Skyrim mission.
We greet you as
What do
Right here.
Well,
Today is your lucky day.
This is a grand
so
day.
let's hear it.
Greetings.
The Wolf Queen, Book 2, by Wowan Jarth. From the pen of the 1st century 3rd Era sage Montakai, 3rd Era 82. A year after the wedding of his 14-year-old granddaughter the Princess Patima to King Mantiarco of the Nordic Kingdom of Solitude, the Emperor Uriel Septim II passed on. His son Pelagius Septim II was made emperor, and he faced a greatly depleted treasury thanks to his father's poor management. As the new Queen of Solitude, Patima faced opposition from the old Nordic houses, who viewed her as an outsider. Mantiarco had been widowed, and his former queen was loved. She had left him a son, Prince Bathorg, who was 2 years older than his stepmother and loved her not. But the king loved his queen, and suffered with her through miscarriage after miscarriage until her 29th year, when she bore him a son. 3rd Era 97. "You must do something to help the pain," Patima cried, baring her teeth. The healer Kelmeth immediately thought of a she-wolf in labor, but he put the image from his mind. Her enemies called her the Wolf Queen for certes, but not because of any physical resemblance. "Your Majesty, there is no injury for me to heal. The pain you feel is natural and helpful for the birth." He was going to add more words of consolation, but he had to break off to duck the mirror she flung at him. "I'm not a pig-nosed peasant girl," she snarled. "I am the Queen of Solitude, daughter of the Emperor. Summon the Daedra. I'll trade the soul of every last subject of mine for a little comfort." "My lady," said the healer nervously, drawing the curtains and blotting out the cold morning sun, "it is not wise to make such offers, even in jest. The eyes of Oblivion are forever watching for just such a rash interjection." "What would you know of Oblivion, healer?" she growled, but her voice was calmer, quieter. The pain had relaxed. "Would you fetch me that mirror I hurled at you?" "Are you going to throw it again, Your Majesty?" said the healer with a taut smile, obeying her. "Very likely," she said, looking at her reflection. "And next time I won't miss. But I do look a fright. Is Lord Vaken still waiting for me in the hall?" "Yes, Your Majesty." "Well, tell him I just need to fix my hair and I'll be with him. And leave us. I'll howl for you when the pain returns." "Yes, Your Majesty." A few minutes later, Lord Vaken was shown into the chamber. He was an enormous bald man whose friends and enemies called Mount Vaken, and when he spoke, it was with the low grumble of thunder. The Queen was one of the very few people Vaken knew who was not the least bit intimidated by him, and he offered her a smile. "My Queen, how are you feeling?" he asked. "Damned. But you're looking like springtide has come to Mount Vaken. I take it from your merry disposition that you've been made war chief." "Only temporarily, while your husband the king investigates whether there's evidence behind the rumors of treason on the part of my predecessor, Lord Thone." "If you've planted it as I've instructed, he'll find it," Patima smiled, propping herself up in the bed. "Tell me, is Prince Bethorg still in the city?" "What a question, Your Highness," laughed the mountain. "It's the Tournament of Stamina today. You know the prince would never miss that. The fellow invents new strategies of self-defense every year to show off during the games. Don't you recall last year, where he entered the ring unarmored and after 20 minutes of fending off 6 bladesmen, left the games without a scratch? He dedicated that bout to his late mother, Queen Amaditha." "Yes, I recall." "He's no friend to me or you, Your Highness, but you must give the man his due respect. He moves like lightning. You wouldn't think it of him, but he always seems to use his awkwardness to his advantage, to throw his opponents off. Some say he learned the style from the orcs to the south. They say he learned from them how to anticipate a foe's attack by some sort of supernatural power." "There's nothing supernatural about it," said the Queen quietly. "He gets it from his father." "Mantiarco never moved like that," Vaken chuckled. "I never said he did," said Patima. Her eyes closed and her teeth gritted together. "The pain's returning. You must fetch the healer, but first, I must ask you one other thing. Has the new summer palace construction begun?" "I think so, Your Highness." "Do not think," she cried, gripping the sheets, biting her lips so a stream of blood dripped down her chin. "Do! Make certain that the construction begins at once, today. Your future, my future, and the future of this child depend on it. Go." 4 hours later, King Mantiarco entered the room to see his son. His queen smiled weakly as he gave her a kiss on the forehead. When she handed him the child, a tear ran down his face. Another one quickly followed, and then another. "My lord," she said fondly, "I know you're sentimental, but really..." "It's not only the child, though he is beautiful with all the fair features of his mother." Mantiarco turned to his wife, sadly, his aged features twisted in agony. "My dear wife, there is trouble at the palace. In truth, this birth is the only thing that keeps this day from being the darkest in my reign." "What is it? Something at the tournament?" Patima pulled herself up in bed. "Something with Bethorg?" "No, it isn't the tournament, but it does relate to Bethorg. I shouldn't worry you at a time like this. You need your rest." "My husband, tell me." "I wanted to surprise you with a gift after the birth of our child, so I had the old summer palace completely renovated. It's a beautiful place, or at least it was. I thought you might like it." Truth to tell, it was Lord Vaken's idea. It used to be Amaditha's favorite place. Bitterness crept into the king's voice. Now I've learned why. What have you learned? Asked Patima quietly. Amaditha deceived me there, with my trusted war chief, Lord Thone. There were letters between them, the most perverse things you've ever read. And that's not the worst of it. No? The dates on the letters correspond with the time of Bethorg's birth. The boy I raised and loved as a son. Mantiarco's voice choked up with emotion. He was Thone's child, not mine. My darling, said Patima, almost feeling sorry for the old man. She wrapped her arms around his neck as he heaved his sobs down on her and their child. Henceforth, he said quietly, Bethorg is no longer my heir. He will be banished from the kingdom. This child you have borne me today will grow to rule solitude. And perhaps more, said Patima. He is the Emperor's grandson as well. We will name him Mantiarco II. My darling, I would love that, said Patima, kissing the king's tear-streaked face. But may I suggest Uriel, after my grandfather, the Emperor, who brought us together in marriage? King Mantiarco smiled at his wife and nodded his head. There was a knock at the door. My liege, said Mount Vaken, His Highness Prince Bethorg has finished the tournament and awaits you to present his award. He has successfully withstood attacks by 9 archers and the giant scorpion we brought in from Hammerfell. The crowd is roaring his name. They are calling him the man who cannot be hit. I will see him, said King Mantiarco sadly, and left the chamber. Oh, he can be hit all right, said Patima wearily. But it does take some doing. Oh, that Wolf Queen is pretty crafty. All right, now we are going to go to the Imperial Chapels by using Divine Intervention. Because I'm getting lazy.
Well met, friend.
Hi there. Let me just scoot on past.
Hail and welcome, friend. Hail!
Hi, I'm reading this. The Monomyth. In Mundus, conflict and disparity are what bring change, and change is the most sacred of the 11 forces. Change is the force without focus or origin. Oegnither. Teherete, Order of Sij. Simply put, the schism in the human Aldmeri worldview is the mortal's relationship to the divine. Humans take the humble path that they were created by the immortal forces, while the Aldmer claim descent from them. It doesn't seem like much, but it is a distinction that colors the rest of their diverging mythologies. All Tamrielic religions begin the same. Man or Mer, things begin with the dualism of Anu and his other. These twin forces go by many names: Anu Padme, Anuiel Sithis, Ak El, Sadak Akel, is not. Anuiel is the everlasting ineffable light. Sithis is the corrupting inexpressible action. In the middle is the gray maybe, Nirn in the Elnifex. In most cultures, Anuiel is honored for his part of the interplay that creates the world, but Sithis is held in highest esteem because he's the one that causes the reaction. Sithis is thus the original creator, an entity who intrinsically causes change without design. Even the Hist acknowledge this being. Anuiel is also perceived of as order, opposed to the Sithis chaos. Perhaps it is easier for mortals to envision change than perfect stasis, for often Anuiel is relegated to the mythic background of Sithis' fancies. In Yokudan folktales, which are among the most vivid in the world, Sadak is referred to only a handful of times as the Hum. He is a force so prevalent as to be not really there at all. In any case, from these two beings spring the Atata, or original spirits. To humans, these Atata are the gods and demons. To the Aldmer, the Aedra Daedra, or the ancestors. All of the Tamrielic pantheons fill their rosters from these Atata, though divine membership often differs from culture to culture. Like Anu and Padme, though, every one of these pantheons contains the archetypes of the Dragon God and the Missing God. The Dragon God and the Missing God. The Dragon God is always related to time, and is universally revered as the first god. He is often called Akatosh, whose perch from eternity allowed the day. He is the central god of the Cyrodiilic Empire. The missing god is always related to the mortal plane, and is a key figure in the human Aldmeri schism. The missing refers to either his palpable absence from the pantheon, another mental distress that is interpreted a variety of ways, or the removal of his divine spark by the other immortals. He is often called Lorcan, and his epitaphs are many, equally damnable and devout. Note that Tamriel and the mortal plane do not exist yet. The Grey Maybe is still the playground of the original spirits. Some are more bound to Anu's light, others to the unknowable void. Their constant flux and interplay increase their number, and their personalities take long to congeal. When Akatosh forms, time begins, and it becomes easier for some spirits to realize themselves as beings with a past and a future. The strongest of the recognizable spirits crystallize: Mephala, Arkay, Ifri, Magnus, Ruptka, etc., etc. Others remain as concepts, ideas, or emotions. One of the strongest of these, a barely formed urge that the others call Lorcan, details a plan to create Mundus, the mortal plane. Humans, with the exception of the Red Guards, see this act as a divine mercy, an enlightenment whereby lesser creatures can reach immortality. Aldmer, with the exception of the Dark Elves, see this act as a cruel deception, a trick that sundered their connection to the spirit plane. The Myth of Arbus. Subtitled The Psijic Compensation, Mythic Arbus was an attempt by Artaeum apologists to explain the basics of Aldmeri religion to Uriel V in the early glorious part of his reign. It quietly avoided any blame or bias against the Lorcan concept, which was still held in esteem by the Cyrodiils as Shazar, the missing sibling of the divines. Despite this, the Psijiki still give a nice summary of the Elder View, and it will serve our purposes here. This version comes from the archives of the Imperial Seminary from the handwritten notes of an unknown scribe. Mythic Arbus exists, and has existed from time without measure, as a fanciful, unnatural realm. Arbus is used to connote the imperceptible penumbra, the gray center between the is-not of Anu and Padme. It contains the multitude realms of Aetherius and Oblivion, as well as other less structured forms. The magical beings of mythic Arbus live for a long time and have complex narrative lives, creating the patterns of myth. These are spirits made from bits of the immortal polarity. The first of these was Akatosh the Time Dragon, whose formation made it easier for other spirits to structure themselves. Gods and demons form and reform and procreate. Finally, the magical beings of mythic Orbis told the ultimate story, that of their own death. For some, this was an artistic transfiguration into the concrete, non-magical substance of the world. For others, this was a war in which all were slain, their bodies becoming the substance of the world. For yet others, this was a romantic marriage and parenthood, with the parent spirits naturally having to die and give way to the succeeding mortal races. The agent of this communal decision was Lorcan, whom most early myths vilify as a trickster or deceiver. More sympathetic versions of this story point out Lorcan as being the reason the mortal plane exists at all. The magical beings created the races of the mortal Arbus in their own image, either consciously as artists and craftsmen, or as the fecund rotting matter out of which the mortals sprung forth, or in a variety of other analogical senses. The magical beings then, having died, became the Atata. The Atata are the things perceived and revered by the mortals as gods, spirits, or geniuses of Arbus. Through their deaths, these magical beings separated themselves in nature from the other magical beings of the unnatural realms. The Daedra were created at this time also, being spirits and gods more attuned to Oblivion, or that realm closer to the void of Padme. This act is the dawn of the mythic Merithic era. It has been perceived by the earliest mortals many different ways, either as a joyous second creation or, especially by the elves, as a painful fracturing from the divine. The originator of the event is always Lorcan. Lorcan. This creator, trickster, tester deity is in every Tamrielic mythic tradition. His most popular name is the Aldmeri Lorcan, or Doom Drum. He convinced or contrived the original spirits to bring about the creation of the mortal plane, upsetting the status quo much like his father Padme had introduced instability into the universe in the beginning place. After the world is materialized, Lorcan is separated from his divine center, sometimes involuntarily, and wanders the creation of the Atata. Interpretations of these events differ widely by culture. Below are some of the better known. Yokuden, Sadakal the World Skin. Sadak was the first serpent, the snake who came before, and all the worlds to come rested in the glimmer of its scales. But it was so big there was nothing but, and thus it was coiled around and around itself, and the worlds to come slid across each other, but none had room to breathe or even be. And so the worlds called to something to save them, to let them out. But of course there was nothing outside the first serpent, so aid had to come from inside it. This was Akel, the hungry stomach. Akel made itself known, and Sadak could only think about what it was, and it was the best hunger, so it ate and ate. Soon there was enough room to live in the worlds, and things began. These things were new, and they often made mistakes, for there was hardly time to practice being things before. So most things ended quickly, or were not good, or gave up on themselves. Some things were about to start, but they were eaten up as Sadak got to that part of its body. This was a violent time. Pretty soon, Akel caused Sadak to bite its own heart, and that was the end. The hunger, though, refused to stop, even in death, and so the first serpent shed its skin to begin anew. As the old world died, Sadakal began, and when things realized this pattern, so did they realize what their part in it was. They began to take names, like Ruptka or Tuwaka, and they strode about looking for their kin. As Sadakal ate itself over and over, the strongest spirits learned to bypass the cycle by moving at strange angles. They called this process the walkabout, a way of striding between the world skins. Ruptka was so big that he was able to place the stars in the sky so that weaker spirits might find their way easier. This practice became so easy for the spirits that it became a place called the Far Shores, a time of waiting until the next skin. Ruptka was able to sire many children through the cycles, and so he became known as the Tall Papa. He continued to place stars to map out the void for others, but after so many cycles there were almost too many spirits to help out. He made himself a helper from the detritus of past skins, and this was Sep, or Second Serpent. Sep had much of the hungry stomach still left in him, multiple hungers from multiple skins. He was so hungry that he could not think straight. Sometimes he would just eat the spirits he was supposed to help, but Tall Papa would always reach in and take them back out. Finally, tired of helping Tall Papa, Sep went and gathered the rest of the old skins and balled them up, tricking spirits to help him, promising them this was how you reached the new world, by making one out of the old. These spirits loved this way of living, as it was easier. No more jumping from place to place. Many spirits joined in, believing this was good thinking. Tall Papa just shook his head. Pretty soon, the spirits on the skin ball started to die because they were very far from the real world of Sadakal. And they found that it was too far to jump into the Far Shores now. The spirits that were left pleaded with Tall Papa to take them back, but Grim Ruptka would not, and he told the spirits that they must learn new ways to follow the stars to the Far Shores now. If they could not, then they must live on through their children, which was not the same as before. Sep, however, needed more punishment, and so Tall Papa squashed the snake with a big stick. The hunger fell out of Sep's dead mouth and was the only thing left of the second serpent. While the rest of the new world was allowed to strive back to godhood, Sep could only slink around in a dead skin or swim about in the sky, a hungry void that jealously tried to eat the stars. Cyrodiilic, Shazar's Song. This was a new thing that Shazar described to the gods, becoming mothers and fathers, being responsible, and making great sacrifices with no guarantee of success. But Shazar spoke beautifully to them and moved them beyond mystery and tears. Thus the Aedra gave free birth to the world, the beasts, and the beings, making these things from parts of themselves. This free birth was very painful, and afterwards the Aedra were no longer young and strong and powerful as they had been from the beginning of days. Some Aedra were disappointed and bitter in their loss, and angry with Shazar, and with all creation, for they felt Shazar had lied and tricked them. These Aedra, the gods of the Aldmer, led by Ariel, were disgusted by their enfeebled selves and by what they had created. Everything is spoiled, for now and for all time, and the most we can do is teach the elven races to suffer nobly, with dignity, and chastise ourselves for our folly, and avenge ourselves upon Shazar and his allies. Thus are the gods of the elves dark and brooding, and thus are the elves ever dissatisfied with mortality, and always proud and stoic despite the harshness of this cruel and indifferent world. Other Aedra looked upon creation and were well pleased. These Aedra, the gods of men and beastfolk, led by Akatosh, praised and cherished their wards, the mortal races. We have suffered, and are diminished, for all time, but the mortal world we have made is glorious, filling our hearts and spirits with hope. Let us teach the mortal races to live well, to cherish beauty and honor, and to love one another as we love them. Thus are the gods of men tender and patient, and thus are men and beastfolk great in heart for joy or suffering, and ambitious for greater wisdom and a better world. Now when the Daedra lords heard Shazar, they mocked him and the other Aedra. Cut parts of ourselves off? And lose them? Forever? That's stupid. You'll be sorry. We are far smarter than you, for we will create a new world out of ourselves, but we will not cut it off or let it mock us, but we will make this world within ourselves, forever ours, and under our complete control. So the Daedra lords created the Daedric realms, and all the ranks of lesser Daedra, great and small. And for the most part, the Daedra lords were well pleased with this arrangement, for they always had worshippers and servants and playthings close to hand. But at the same time, they sometimes looked with envy upon the mortal realms, for though mortals were foul and feeble and contemptible, their passions and ambitions were also far more surprising and entertaining than the antics of the lesser Daedra. Thus do the Daedra lords court and seduce certain amusing specimens of the mortal races, especially the passionate and powerful. It gives the Daedra lords special pleasure to steal away from Shazar and the Aedra the greatest and most ambitious mortals. Not only are you fools to mutilate yourselves, gloat the Daedra lords, but you cannot even keep the best pieces, which prefer the glory and power of the Daedra lords to the feeble vulgarity of the mush-minded Aedra. Altmeri, the heart of the world. Anu encompassed, and encompasses, all things. So that he might know himself, he created Anuiel, his soul and the soul of all things. Anuiel, as all souls, was given to self-reflection, and for this he needed to differentiate between his forms, attributes, and intellects. Thus was born Sithis, who was the sum of all the limitations Anuiel would utilize to ponder himself. Anuiel, who was the soul of all things, therefore became many things, and this interplay was and is the Arbus. At first the Arbus was turbulent and confusing, as Anuiel's ruminations went on without design. Aspects of the Arbus then asked for a schedule to follow or procedures whereby they might enjoy themselves a little longer outside of perfect knowledge. So that he might know himself this way too, Anu created Ariel, the soul of his soul. Ariel bled through the Arbus as a new force called time. With time, various aspects of the Arbus began to understand their natures and limitations. They took names like Magnus or Mara or Zen. One of these, Lorcan, was more of a limit than a nature, so he could never last long anywhere. As he entered every aspect of Anuiel, Lorcan would plant an idea that was almost wholly based on limitation. He outlined a plan to create a soul for the Arbus, a place where the aspects of aspects might even be allowed to self-reflect. He gained many followers. Even Ariel, when told he would become the king of the New World, agreed to help Lorcan. So they created the Mundus, where their own aspects might live, and became the Atata. But this was a trick. As Lorcan knew, this world contained more limitations than not, and was therefore hardly a thing of Anu at all. Mundus was the house of Sithis. As their aspects began to die off, many of the Atata vanished completely. Some escaped, like Magnus, and that is why there are no limitations to magic. Others, like Ifri, transformed themselves into the Elnifei, the Earthbones, so that the whole world might not die. Some had to marry and make children just to last. Each generation was weaker than the last, and soon there were Altmer. Darkness caved in. Lorcan made armies out of the weakest souls and named them men, and they brought Sithis into every quarter. Ariel pleaded with Anu to take them back, but he had already filled their places with something else. But his soul was gentler and granted Ariel his bow and shield, so that he might save the Altmer from the hordes of men. Some had already fallen, like the Chimer, who listened to tainted Atata, and others, like the Bosmer, had soiled Time's line by taking mannish wives. Ariel could not save Altmora, the Elderwood, and it was lost to men. They were chased south and east to Old Elnafay, and Lorcan was close behind. He shattered that land into many. Finally Trinimac, Ariel's greatest knight, knocked Lorcan down in front of his army and reached in with more than hands to take his heart. He was undone. The men dragged Lorcan's body away and swore blood vengeance on the heirs of Ariel for all time. But when Trinimac and Ariel tried to destroy the heart of Lorcan, it laughed at them. It said, "This heart is the heart of the world, for one was made to satisfy the other." So Ariel fastened the thing to an arrow and let it fly long into the sea, where no aspect of the new world may ever find it. Creation myths. Fun. Okay, now...
I'd be happy to talk. My pleasure, really.
You might be happy to talk, but Fedar is on a mission to do some reading.
You seem like very good company.
Why, thank you. I suppose I am. That's accurate, yes. Now, this is the dowry. Not we've already read wedding dowry, which wedding dowry in Storytime episode the dowry. 1. Just the dowry. Clarify that. Okay, calm down. Wait till I read it. The Dowry. Ancient Tales of the Dwemer, Part 10, by Marabar Sul. Inale was the wealthiest landowner in Gunnel, and he had over the years saved a tremendous dowry for the man who would marry his daughter, Jennifer. When she reached the age of consent, he locked the gold away for safekeeping and announced his intention to have her marry. She was a comely lass, a scholar, a great athlete, but dour and brooding in aspect. This personality defect did not bother her potential suitors any more than her positive traits impressed them. Every man knew the tremendous wealth that would be his as the husband of Jennifer and son-in-law of Inale. That alone was enough for hundreds to come to Gunnel to pay court. "The man who will marry my daughter," said Inale to the assembled, "must not be doing so purely out of avarice. He must demonstrate his own wealth to my satisfaction." This simple pronouncement removed a vast majority of the suitors, who knew they could not impress the landowner with their meager fortunes. A few dozen did come forward within a few days, clad in fine killerk cloth of spun silver, accompanied by exotic servants, traveling in magnificent carriages. Of all who came who met with Inale's approval, none arrived in a more resplendent fashion than Wellin Nerlich. The young man, who no one had ever heard of, arrived in a shining ebon coach drawn by a team of dragons, his clothing of rarest manufacture, and accompanied by an army of the most fantastical servants any of Gunnel had ever seen. Valets with eyes on all sides of their heads, maidservants that seemed cast in gemstones. But such was not enough with Inale. "The man who marries my daughter must prove himself an intelligent fellow, for I would not have an ignoramus as a son-in-law and business partner," he declared. This eliminated a large part of the wealthy suitors, who, through their lives of luxury, had never needed to think very much, if at all. Still some came forward over the next few days, demonstrating their wit and learning, quoting the great sages of the past and offering their philosophies of metaphysics and alchemy. Wellin Nerlich, too, came and asked Inale to dine at the villa he had rented outside of Gunnel. There, the landowner saw scores of scribes working on translations of Altmerry tracts, and enjoyed the young man's somewhat irreverent but intriguing intelligence. Nevertheless, though he was much impressed with Wellin Nerlich, Inale had another challenge. "I love my daughter very much," said Inale, "and I hope that the man who marries her will make her happy as well. Should any of you make her smile, she and the great dowry are yours." The suitors lined up for days, singing her songs, proclaiming their devotion, describing her beauty in the most poetic of terms. Jennifer merely glared at all with hatred and melancholia. Inale, who stood by her side, began to despair at last. His daughter's suitors were failing to a man at this task. Finally, Welyn Nerlich came to the chamber. "I will make your daughter smile," he said. "I dare say I'll make her laugh, but only after you've agreed to marry us. If she is not delighted within 1 hour of our engagement, the wedding can be called off." Inalé turned to his daughter. She was not smiling, but her eyes had sparked with some morbid curiosity in this young man. As no other suitor had even registered that for her, he agreed. "The dowry is naturally not to be paid till after you've wed," said Inalé. "Being engaged is not enough." "Might I see the dowry still?" asked Welyn. Knowing how fabled the treasure was, and understanding that this would likely be the closest the young man would come to possessing it, Inalé agreed. He had grown quite fond of Welyn. On his orders, Welyn, Inalé, Glum Jennifer, and the Castellan delved deep into the stronghold of Gunnel. The first vault had to be opened by touching a series of runic symbols. Should one of the marks be mispressed, a volley of poisoned arrows would have struck the thief. Inalé was particularly proud of the next level of security. A lock composed of blades with 18 tumblers required 3 keys to be turned simultaneously to allow entry. The blades were designed to eviscerate any who merely picked one of the locks. Finally, they reached the storeroom. It was entirely empty. "By Lorcan, we've been burgled!" cried Inalé. "But how? Who could have done this?" "A humble, but, if I may say so, rather talented burglar," said Welyn. "A man who has loved your daughter from afar for many years, but did not possess the glamour or the learning to impress. That is, until the gold from her dowry afforded me the opportunity." "You?" bellowed Inalé, scarcely able to believe it. Then something even more unbelievable happened. Jennifer began to laugh. She had never even dreamed of meeting anyone like this thief. She threw herself into his arms before her father's outraged eyes. After a moment, Inalé too began to laugh. Jennifer and Welyn were married in a month's time. Though he was in fact quite poor and had little scholarship, Inalé was amazed how much his wealth increased with such a son-in-law and business partner. He only made certain never to ask from whence came the excess gold. Publisher's note: the tale of a man trying to win the hand of a maiden whose father, usually a wealthy man or a king, tests each suitor is quite common. See, for instance, the more recent 4 Suitors of Benita by Joel Yoloves. The behavior of the characters is quite out of character for the Dwemer. No one today knows their marriage customs, or even if they had marriage at all. One rather odd theory of the disappearance of the dwarves came from this and a few other tales of Marabar Sul. It was proposed that the Dwemer never, in fact, left. They did not depart Nirn, much less the continent of Tamriel, and they are still among us, disguised. These scholars use the story of Azura and the Box to suggest that the Dwemer feared Azura, a being they could neither understand nor control, and they adopted the dress and manner of Keimer and Altmer in order to hide from Azura's gaze. Yeah, they're just hiding. I'm sure that's it. Right, well, we are done with the Imperial Chapels.
With pleasure. Please, go ahead. I'm all ears.
I'm trying to go ahead, but you are quite handily preventing me from doing that. Let's just, Your mysticism skill increased to 23. Okay, whatever works. And we are now going to head in here. To the Imperial Commission.
I've heard a lot about you, Outlander. Go ahead.
Let's see. This is what we're reading next. The Wolf Queen, Book 5, by Wowan Jarth. From the pen of Inzalicus, 2nd century sage and student of Montakai. 3rd era 119. For 21 years, the Emperor Antiochus Septim ruled Tamriel and proved an able leader despite his moral laxity. His greatest victory was in the War of the Isle in the year 110, when the Imperial fleet and the royal navies of Somerset Isle, together with the magical powers of the Sigic Order, succeeded in destroying the Pyandanian invading armada. His siblings, King Magnus of Lilmoth, King Sephirus of Ghilain, and Patima, the Wolf Queen of Solitude, ruled well, and relations between the Empire and the kingdoms of Tamriel were much improved. Still, centuries of neglect had not repaired all the scars that existed between the Empire and the kings of High Rock and Skyrim. During a rare visitation from his sister and nephew Uriel, Antiochus, who had suffered from several illnesses over his reign, lapsed into a coma. For months he lingered in between life and death while the Elder Council prepared for the ascension of his 15-year-old daughter Kintyra to the throne. Third Era 120. "Mother, I can't marry Kintyra," said Uriel, more amused by the suggestion than offended. "She's my first cousin. And besides, I believe she's engaged to one of the Lords of Council, Medellus." "You're so squeamish. There's a time and a place for propriety," said Patima. "But you're correct at any rate about Medellus, and we shouldn't offend the Elder Council at this critical juncture. How do you feel about Princess Rachma? You spent a good deal of time in her company in Far Run." "She's all right," said Uriel. "Don't tell me you want to hear all the dirty details." "Please spare me your study of her anatomy," Patima grimaced. "But would you marry her?" "I suppose so." "Very good. I'll make the arrangements then." Patima made a note for herself before continuing. "King Laromo has been a difficult ally to keep, and a political marriage should keep Far Run on our side, should we need them. When is the funeral?" "What funeral?" asked Uriel. "You mean for Uncle Antiochus?" "Of course," sighed Patima. "Anyone else of note die recently?" "There were a bunch of little Redguard children running through the halls, so I guess Sephirus has arrived. Magnus arrived at court yesterday, so it ought to be any day now." "It's time to address the council then," said Patima, smiling. She dressed in black, not her usual colorful ensembles. It was important to look the part of the grieving sister. Regarding herself in the mirror, she felt that she looked all of her 53 years. A shock of silver wound its way through her auburn hair. The long, cold, dry winters in northern Skyrim had created a map of wrinkles, thin as a spiderweb, all across her face. Still, she knew that when she smiled, she could win hearts, and when she frowned, she could inspire fear. It was enough for her purposes. Patima's speech to the Elder Council is perhaps helpful to students of public speaking. She began with flattery and self-abasement. "My most august and wise friends, members of the Elder Council, I am but a provincial queen, and I can only assume to bring to issue what you yourselves must have already pondered." She continued on to praise the late emperor, who had been a popular ruler despite his flaws. He was a true septim and a great warrior, destroying, with your counsel, the near-invincible armada of Pyandania. But little time was wasted before she came to her point. "The Empress Gisela unfortunately did nothing to temper my brother's lustful spirits. In point of fact, no whore in the slums of the city spread out on more beds than she. Had she attended to her duties in the imperial bedchamber more faithfully, we would have a true heir to the empire, not the half-wit milksop bastards who call themselves the emperor's children. The girl called Kintyra is popularly believed to be the daughter of Gisela and the captain of the guard. It may be that she is the daughter of Gisela and the boy who cleans the cistern. We can never know for certain. Not as certainly as we can know the lineage of my son, Uriel, the eldest true son of the Septim dynasty. My lords, the princes of the empire will not stand for a bastard on the throne. That I can assure you." She ended mildly, but with a call to action. "Posterity will judge you. You know what must be done." That evening, Patima entertained her brothers and their wives in the map room, her favorite of the imperial dining chambers. The walls were splashed with bright, if fading, representations of the Empire and all the known lands beyond, Atmora, Yokuda, Akavir, Pyandania, Thras. Overhead, the great glass-domed ceiling, wet with rain, displayed distorted images of the stars overhead. Lightning flashed every other minute, casting strange phantom shadows on the walls. "When will you speak to the council?" asked Patima as dinner was served. "I don't know if I will," said Magnus. "I don't believe I have anything to say." I'll speak to them when they announce the coronation of Kintyra, said Sepphoris, merely as a formality to show my support and the support of Hammerfell. You can speak for all of Hammerfell? Asked Patima with a teasing smile. The Redguards must love you very much. We have a unique relationship with the Empire in Hammerfell, said Sepphoris' wife Bianchi. Since the Treaty of Strosum Kai, it's been understood that we are part of the Empire, but not a subject. I understand you've already spoken to the Council, said Magnus's wife Helena pointedly. She was a diplomat by nature, but as the Cyrodiilic ruler of an Argonian kingdom, she knew how to recognize and confront adversity. Yes, I have, said Patima, pausing to savor a slice of braised jolfbird. I gave them a short speech about the coronation this afternoon. Our sister is an excellent public speaker, said Sepphoris. You're too kind, said Patima, laughing. I do many things better than speaking. Such as? Asked Bianchi, smiling. Might I ask what you said in your speech? Asked Magnus suspiciously. There was a knock on the chamber door. The head steward whispered something to Patima, who smiled in response and rose from the table. I told the council that I would give my full support to the coronation, provided they proceed with wisdom. What could be sinister about that? Patima said, and took her glass of wine with her to the door. If you'll pardon me, my niece Kintyra wishes to have a word with me. Kintyra stood in the hall with the Imperial Guard. She was but a child, but on reflection, Patima realized that at her age, she was already married 2 years to Mantiarco. There was a similarity, to be certain. Patima could see Kintyra as the young queen, with dark eyes and pallid skin smooth and resolute like marble. Anger flashed momentarily in Kintyra's eyes on seeing her aunt, but emotion left her, replaced with calm imperial presence. Queen Patima, she said serenely, I have been informed that my coronation will take place in 2 days' time. Your presence at the ceremony will not be welcome. I have already given orders to your servants to have your belongings packed, and an escort will be accompanying you back to your kingdom tonight. That is all. Goodbye, Aunt. Patima began to reply, but Kintyra and her guard turned and moved back down the corridor to the stateroom. The Wolf Queen watched them go, and then re-entered the map room. Sister-in-law, said Patima, addressing Bianchi with deep malevolence. You asked what I do better than speaking. The answer is war. Dun dun dun.
I see I stand in good company. What can I do for you?
You sure do. I'm great company. And I'm done here. So... it is time to take a boat to Hlaod.
Greetings. Speak freely, friend.
In this lovely, lovely downpour.
May each day greet you warmly.
That's not sarcasm. I like the rain.
Keep moving. What was that?
It's just the rain. Don't worry about it. Hey, everybody.
Well met, friend.
How can I help? I'll do what
I do enjoy a good time.
Okay. To Hlaod we go.
Walk with virtue, Outlander.
Okay. Let's see. Yeah, this is where we're going next.
Yes, Dwemer?
I just want to read your book. The Charwich-Koniinge Letters, Book 2. Third of Last Seed, Third Era 411. Teleroon, Morrowind. My good friend Charwich, I only just last week received your letter dated 6th of Sun's Height, addressed to me in Sadrith Mora. I did not know how to reach you before to tell you of my progress finding Hadwath Nightwear, so I send this to you now, care of the lady you mentioned in your letter, the Lady Ellisbetta Morling of Wayrest. I hope that if you have left her palace, she will know where you've gone and can send this to you. And I hope further that you receive it in a timelier manner than I received your letter. It is essential that I hear from you soon so we may coordinate our next course of action. My adventures here have 2 acts, one before I received your letter and one immediately after. While you searched for the elusive possessor of Azura's star in his homeland to the west, I searched for him here, where we understood he conjured up the Daedra Prince and received from her the artifact. Like you, I had little difficulty finding people who had heard of or even knew Nightwear. In fact, not long after we parted company and you left for the Iliac Bay, I met someone who knew where he went to perform the ceremony, so I left at once to come here to Tel'aroon. It took some time to locate my contact, for he is a dissident priest named Minerath. The Temple and Tribunal, the real powers of Morrowind, tend to frown on his order, and while they haven't begun so much of a crusade to stamp them out, there are certainly rumors that they will soon. This tends to make priests like Minerath skittish and paranoid, difficult people to set appointments with. Finally, I was told that he would be willing to talk to me at the Plot and Plaster, a tiny tavern without even a room to rent. Downstairs, there were several cloaked men crammed around the tavern's only table, and they searched me to see if I had any weaponry. Of course I hadn't. You know that isn't my preferred method of doing business. When it was decided that I was harmless, one of the cloaked figures revealed himself to be Minerath. I paid him the gold I promised and asked him what he knew about Hadwaf Nightwear. He remembered him well enough, saying that after he received the star, the lad intended to return to High Rock. It seemed he had unfinished business there, presumably of a violent nature, which Azura's star would facilitate. He had no other information, and I did not know what else to ask. We parted company, and I waited for your letter, hoping you had found Nightwear, and perhaps even the star. I confess that as I lingered in Morrowind and never heard from you, I began to have doubts about your character. You'll forgive me for saying so, but I began to fear that you had taken the artifact for yourself. In fact, I was making plans to come to High Rock myself when your letter came at last. The tale of your adventure in the cemetery at Grimtree Garden and the information you gathered from the lycanthropic caretaker inspired me to have another meeting with Minerath. Thus began the second act of my story. I returned to the Pot and Plaster, reasoning that the priest must frequent that area of the city to feel so comfortable setting clandestine meetings there. It took some time searching, but I finally found him, and as luck would have it, he was alone. I called his name, and he quickly drew me to a dark alleyway, nervous that we would be seen by a temple ordinator. It is a rare and beautiful thing when a victim insists on dragging his killer to a remote location. I began at once asking about this fellow you mentioned, Nightwear's mysterious patron Beliasar. He denied ever having heard the name. We were still in that easy, fairly conversational state when I attacked the priest. Of course, he was completely taken by surprise. In some ways, that can be more effective than an ambush from behind. No matter how many times I've done it, no one ever expected the friendly man they're talking to grip them by the neck. I pressed hard against my favorite spot in the soft part of the throat, just below the thyroid cartilage, and it took him too long to react to my lunge and try pushing back. He began to lose consciousness, and I whispered that if I released my grip a little so he could talk and breathe, but he tried to call for help, I would snap his neck. He nodded, and I relaxed the pressure, just a bit. I asked him again about Beliasar, and he shook his head, insisting that he had never heard the name. As frightened as he was, it seemed most likely that he was telling the truth, so I asked him more generally if he knew anyone else who might know something about Hadwaf Nightwear. He told me that there was a woman present also during the ceremony, someone he introduced as his sister. I remembered then the part of your letter about seeing the grave of Nightwear's sister, Perira. When I mentioned the name to the priest, he nodded frantically, but I could see that the interrogation had reached an ending. There is, after all, something about being throttled that causes a man to answer yes to every question. I snapped Minerath's neck and returned home. So now I'm again unsure how to proceed. I've made several more inquiries, and several of the same people who met Nightwear remember him being with a woman. A few recall him saying that she was his sister. One or two believe they remember her name as being Perira, though they're not certain. No one, however, has heard of anyone named Beliasar. If I do not hear word from you in response to this in the next couple of weeks, I will come to High Rock, because it's there that most people believe Nightwear returned. I will only stay here long enough to see if there are other inquiries I can make only in Morrowind to bring us closer to our goal of recovering Azura's star. Your friend, Koniinge. Well, alright, Charwich and Koniinge sound like a couple of real stand-up dudes. Yes, they do. Next book is in here. Hello. A Dance in Fire, Chapter 1, by Woan Jarth. Scene: the Imperial City, Cyrodiil. Date: 7th of Frostfall, 3rd Era 397. It seemed as if the palace had always housed the Atreus Building Commission, the company of clerks and estate agents who authored and notarized nearly every construction of any note in the Empire. It had stood for 250 years, since the reign of Emperor Magnus, a plain-fronted and austere hall on a minor but respectable plaza in the Imperial City. Energetic and ambitious middle-class lads and ladies worked there, as well as complacent middle-aged ones like Decumus Scotty. No one could imagine a world without the Commission, least of all Scotty. To be accurate, he could not imagine a world without himself in the Commission. Lord Atreus is perfectly aware of your contributions, said the managing clerk, closing the shutter that demarcated Scotty's office behind him. But you know that things have been difficult. Yes, said Scotty stiffly. Lord Van Eyck's men have been giving us a lot of competition lately, and we must be more efficient if we are to survive. Unfortunately, that means releasing some of our historically best, but presently underachieving senior clerks. I understand. Can't be helped. I'm glad that you understand, smiled the managing clerk, smiling thinly and withdrawing. Please have your room cleared immediately. Scotty began the task of organizing all his work to pass on to his successor. It would probably be young Imbralius who would take most of it on, which was as it should be, he considered philosophically. The lad knew how to find business. Scotty wondered idly what the fellow would do with the contracts for the new statue of Saint Alessia for which the Temple of the One had applied. Probably invent a clerical error, blame it on his old predecessor Decumus Scotty, and require an additional cost to rectify. I have a correspondence for Decumus Scotty of the Atreus Building Commission. Scotty looked up. A fat-faced courier had entered his office and was thrusting forth a sealed scroll. He handed the boy a gold piece and opened it up. By the poor penmanship, atrocious spelling and grammar, and overall unprofessional tone, it was manifestly evident who the writer was. Laides Juris, a fellow clerk some years before, who had left the commission after being accused of unethical business practices. Dear Scotty, I imagine you always wondered what happened to me, and the last place you would have expected to find me is out in the woods. But that's exactly where I am. Haha. If you're smart and want to make a lot of extra gold for Lord Atreus, and yourself, haha, you'll come down to Valenwood too. If you haven't or have been following the politics here lately, you may or may not know that there's been a war between the Boschmer and their neighbors elsewhere over the past 2 years. Things have only just calmed down, and there's a lot that needs to be rebuilt. Now I've got more business than I can handle, but I need someone with some clout, someone representing a respected agency to get the quill in the ink. That someone is you, my fiend. Come and meet me at the Muther Pascos Tavern in Falinesti, Valenwood. I'll be here 2 weeks, and you won't be sorry. Juris. P.S. Bring a wagon load of timber if you can. What do you have there, Scotty? Asked a voice. Scotty started. It was Imbralius, his damnably handsome face peeking through the shutters, smiling in that way that melted the hearts of the stingiest of patrons and the roughest of stonemasons. Scotty shoved the letter in his jacket pocket. Personal correspondence, he sniffed. I'll be cleared up here in just a moment. I don't want to hurry you, said Imbralius, grabbing a few sheets of blank contracts from Scotty's desk. I've just gone through a stack, and the junior scribes' hands are all cramping up, so I thought you wouldn't miss a few. The lad vanished. Scotty retrieved the letter and read it again. He thought about his life, something he rarely did. It seemed a sea of gray with a black, insurmountable wall looming. There was only one narrow passage he could see in that wall. Quickly, before he had a moment to reconsider it, he grabbed a dozen of the blank contracts with the shimmering gold leaf Atreus Building Commission by appointment of His Imperial Majesty and hid them in the satchel with his personal effects. The next day, he began his adventure with a giddy lack of hesitation. He arranged for a seat in a caravan bound for Valenwood, the single escorted conveyance to the southeast leaving the Imperial City that week. He had scarcely hours to pack, but he remembered to purchase a wagon load of timber. "It will be extra gold to pay for a horse to pull that," frowned the convoy head. "So I anticipated," smiled Scotty with his best imbroglious grin. 10 wagons in all set off that afternoon through the familiar Cyrodiilic countryside. Past fields of wildflowers, gently rolling woodlands, friendly hamlets. The clop of the horses' hooves against the sound stone road reminded Scotty that the Atreus Building Commission constructed it. 5 of the 18 necessary contracts for its completion were drafted by his own hand. "Very smart of you to bring that wood along," said a gray-whiskered Breton man next to him on his wagon. "You must be in commerce." "Of a sort," said Scotty, in a way he hoped was mysterious, before introducing himself. "Decumus Scotty." "Griff Malin," said the man. "I'm a poet, actually a translator of old Bosmer literature. I was researching some newly discovered tracts of the Menoriad play bar 2 years ago when the war broke out and I had to leave. You are no doubt familiar with the Menoriad, if you're aware of the Green Pact." Scotty thought the man might be speaking perfect gibberish, but he nodded his head. "Naturally, I don't pretend that the Menoriad is as renowned as the Me Aelidian, or as ancient as the Dancer Gaul, but I think it has a remarkable significance to understanding the nature of the Merilithic Bosmer mind. The origin of the Wood Elf aversion to cutting their own wood or eating any plant material at all, yet paradoxically their willingness to import plant stuff from other cultures, I feel can be linked to a passage in the Menoriad." Malin shuffled through some of his papers, searching for the appropriate text. To Scotty's vast relief, the carriage soon stopped to camp for the night. They were high on a bluff over a gray stream, and before them was the great valley of Valenwood. Only the cry of seabirds declared the presence of the ocean to the bay to the west. Here the timber was so tall and wide, twisting around itself like an impossible knot begun eons ago, to be impenetrable. A few more modest trees, only 50 feet to the lowest branches, stood on the cliff at the edge of camp. The sight was so alien to Scotty, and he found himself so anxious about the proposition of entering the wilderness that he could not imagine sleeping. Fortunately, Malin had supposed he had found another academic with a passion for the riddles of ancient cultures. Long into the night, he recited Bosmer verse in the original and in his own translation, sobbing and bellowing and whispering wherever appropriate. Gradually, Scotty began to feel drowsy, but a sudden crack of wood snapping made him sit straight up. "What was that?" Malin smiled. "I like it too. Convocation in the malignity of the moonless speculum. A dance of fire. There are some enormous birds up in the trees moving around," whispered Scotty, pointing in the direction of the dark shapes above. "I wouldn't worry about that," said Malin, irritated with his audience. Now listen to how the poet characterizes Hermamora's invocation in the 18th stanza of the 4th book. "The dark shapes in the trees were some of them perched like birds, others slithered like snakes, and still others stood up straight like men." As Malin recited his verse, Scotty watched the figures softly leap from branch to branch, half gliding across impossible distances for anything without wings. They gathered in groups and then reorganized until they had spread to every tree around the camp. Suddenly, they plummeted from the heights. "Mara!" cried Scotty. "They're falling like rain!" "Probably seed pods," Malin shrugged, not turning around. "Some of the trees have remarkable—" The camp erupted into chaos. Fires burst out in the wagons. The horses wailed from mortal blows. Casks of wine, fresh water, and liquor gushed their contents to the ground. A nimble shadow dashed past Scotty and Malin, gathering sacks of grain and gold with impossible agility and grace. Scotty had only one glance at it, lit up by a sudden nearby burst of flame. It was a sleek creature with pointed ears, wide yellow eyes, mottled pie fur, and a tail like a whip. "Werewolf," he whimpered, shrinking back. "Cathay rot," groaned Malin. "Much worse. Khajiit cousins or some such thing, come to plunder." "Are you sure?" As quickly as they struck, the creatures retreated, diving off the bluff before the battle mage and knight, the caravan's escorts, had fully opened their eyes. Malin and Scotty ran to the precipice and saw 100 feet below the tiny figures dash out of the water, shake themselves, and disappear into the wood. "Werewolves aren't acrobats like that," said Malin. "They were definitely Cathay rot. Bastard thieves. Thanks Stendar they didn't realize the value of my notebooks. It wasn't a complete loss." All right, whatever you say, Malin.
Head on.
I shall. Our final bit of reading today is in Fat Legs Drop Off. And down. Hello. I remember killing him. He was a jerk.
Go ahead. I am listening.
Oh, you wanna hear me read? Okay. Surfeit of Thieves by Anais Noru. "This looks interesting," said Indik, his eyes narrowing to observe the black caravan making its way to the spires of the secluded castle. A gaudy alien coat of arms marked each carriage, the lacquer glistening in the light of the moons. "Who do you suppose they are?" "They're obviously well off," smiled his partner Haraya. "Perhaps some new imperial cult dedicated to the acquisition of wealth?" "Go into town and find out what you can about the castle," said Indik. "I'll see if I can learn anything about who these strangers are. We meet on this hill tomorrow night." Haraya had two great skills: picking locks and picking information. By dusk of the following day, she had returned to the hill. Indik joined her an hour later. "The place is called Ald O'Lyra," she explained. "It dates back to the Second Era when a collection of nobles built it to protect themselves during one of the epidemics. They didn't want any of the diseased masses to get into their midst and spread the plague, so they built up quite a sophisticated security system for the time. Of course, it's mostly fallen into ruin, but I have a good idea about what kind of locks and traps might still be operational. What did you find out?" "I wasn't nearly so successful," frowned Indik. "No one seemed to have any idea about the group, even that they were here. I was about to give up, but at the charter house, I met a monk who said that his masters were a hermetic group called the Order of St. Yadnoa. I talked to him for some time, this fellow by the name of Prathian, and it seems they're having some sort of ritual feast tonight." "Are they wealthy?" asked Haraya impatiently. "Embarrassingly so, according to the fellow. But they're only at the castle for tonight." "I have my picks on me," winked Haraya. "Opportunity has smiled on us." She drew a diagram of the castle in the dirt. The main hall and kitchen were near the front gate, and the stables and secure armory were in the back. The thieves had a system that never failed. Haraya would find a way into the castle and collect as much loot as possible, while Indik provided the distraction. He waited until his partner had scaled the wall before rapping on the gate. Perhaps this time he would be a bard, or a lost adventurer. The details were most fun to improvise. Haraya heard Indik talking to the woman who came to the gate, but she was too far away to hear the words exchanged. He was evidently successful. A moment later, she heard the door shut. The man had charm, she would give him that. Only a few of the traps and locks to the armory had been set. Undoubtedly, many of the keys had been lost in time. Whatever servants had been in charge of securing the Order's treasures had brought a few new locks to affix. It took extra time to maneuver the intricate hasps and bolts of the new traps before proceeding to the old but still working systems, but Haraya found her heart beating with anticipation. Whatever lay beyond the door, she thought, must be of sufficient value to merit such protection. When at last the door swung quietly open, the thief found her avaricious dreams paled to reality. A mountain of golden treasure, ancient relics glimmering with untapped magicka, weaponry of matchless quality, gemstones the size of her fist, row after row of strange potions, and stacks of valuable documents and scrolls. She was so enthralled by the sight, she did not hear the man behind her approach. "You must be Lady Tressid," said the voice, and she jumped. It was a monk in a black hooded robe, intricately woven with silver and gold threads. For a moment, she could not speak. This was the sort of encounter that Indik loved, but she could think to do nothing but nod her head with what she hoped looked like certainty. I'm afraid I'm a little lost, she stammered. I can see that, the man laughed. That's the armory. I'll show you the way to the dining hall. We were afraid you weren't going to arrive. The feast is nearly over. Haraya followed the monk across the courtyard to the double doors leading to the dining hall. A robe identical to the one he was wearing hung on a hook outside, and he handed it to her with a knowing smile. She slipped it on. She mimicked him as she lowered the hood over her head and entered the hall. Torches illuminated the figures within around the large table. Each wore the uniform black robe that covered all features, and from the look of things, the feast was over. Empty plates, platters, and glasses filled every inch of the wood with only the faintest spots and dribbles of the food remaining. It was a breaking of a fast, it seemed. For a moment, Haraya stopped to think about poor lost Lady Tressid, who had missed her opportunity for gluttony. The only unusual item on the table was its centerpiece, a huge golden hourglass which was on its last minute's worth of sand. Though each person looked alike, some were sleeping, some were chatting merrily to one another, and one was playing a lute. Indik's lute, she noticed, and then noticed Indik's ring on the man's finger. Haraya was suddenly grateful for the anonymity of the hood. Perhaps Indik would not realize that it was she, and that she had blundered. Tressid, said the young man to the assembled, who turned as one to her and burst into applause. The conscious members of the order arose to kiss her hand and introduce themselves. Nerdla, Zulek, Kyler. The names got stranger. Toniop, Hatilitz, Neutrap. She could not help laughing. I understand. It's all backwards. Your real names are Aldrin, Celius, Relic, Poinot, Stillith, Parathian. Of course, said the young man. Won't you have a seat? Say, giggled Haraya, getting into the spirit of the mask and taking an empty chair. I suppose that when the hourglass runs out, the backwards names go back to normal? That's correct, Tressid, said the woman next to her. It's just one of our order's little amusements. This castle seemed like the appropriately ironic venue for our feast, devised as it was to shun the plague victims who were, in their way, a walking dead. Haraya felt herself light-headed from the odor of the torches and bumped into the sleeping man next to her. He fell face forward onto the table. Poor Ezruk Tisrif, said a neighboring man, helping to prop the body up. He's given us so much. Haraya stumbled to her feet and began walking uncertainly for the front gate. Where are you going, Tressid? Asked one of the figures, his voice taking on an unpleasant mocking quality. My name isn't Tressid, she mumbled, gripping Indik's arm. I'm sorry, partner. We need to go. The last crumb of sand fell in the hourglass as the man pulled back his hood. It was not Indik. It was not even human, but a stretched grotesquerie of a man with hungry eyes and a wide mouth filled with tusk-like fangs. Haraya fell back into the chair of the figure they called Ezruk Tisrif. His hood fell open, revealing the pallid, bloodless face of Indik. As she began to scream, they fell on her. In her last living moment, Haraya finally spelled Tressid backwards. Oops. Now Haraya is a food. Ah well. That's all the reading for now, so let's return to Balmora, using Almcivi Intervention. It has to work, of course. There we go. That wasn't so bad. Back to the Fighters Guild.
May you find all.
Or Guild of Fighters, as the tooltip said.
Well met.
Bit inconsistent. All right. We just read The Marksmanship Lesson, The Wolf Queen, Book 2, The Monomyth, The Dowry, Ancient Tales of the Dwemer, Part 10, The Wolf Queen, Book 5, The Charwich-Koniinge Letters, Book 2, A Dance in Fire, Chapter 1, and Surfeit of Thieves. Now that Fedar's caught up on his reading, he can continue questing. And he'll do that in the next video. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you then.